All right, we are recording Writer's Quicksand, Analysis Paralysis. Thank you all for joining us today for the 2023 Write Hive Conference. I am XM Moon. I'm a full-time freelance professional editor and designer, also an author of a handful of novellas and short stories. And I will let our panelists go ahead and introduce themselves for you, starting with Rosiee.
Hi, I'm Rosiee Thor. I write young adult science fiction and fantasy mostly. My books are Tarnished Are the Stars, Fire Becomes Her, and most recently, Steph's Story, which is a tie-in for the Life is Strange series.
Gemma.
Hi, so I'm Gemma Clatworthy, and I write urban fantasy under the imaginative pen name of G. Clatworthy. I live over in Wiltshire in the UK with my family and two cats, or I should say two ill-behaved cats. And when I'm not writing, I love chocolate, tea, and board games.
Lora Beth.
I'm Lora Beth Johnson. I'm the author of Goddess in the Machine and its sequel, Devil in the Device. And I live in North Carolina with my tiny dog, who you will probably hear bark in the background at some point.
Hi, I'm Finnian Burnett. I'm a college instructor and a writer. I have several novels published by independent queer publishing houses, and my most recent novella in Flash, The Clothes Make the Man, was published by Ad Hoc Fiction in the UK. And my newest collection is coming out this summer through Off Topic Publishing.
And Matthew Phillion. I write mostly YA superhero novels. Branched off into a recent fantasy series. The superheroes are the Indestructibles, and the Dungeon Crawlers is the fantasy stuff. My most recent book was a prequel to my very first books, Doc Silence, The Cost of Magic. And I am a full-time writer, though not always in fiction. So I kind of cobble together a life with words.
And again, thank you all for joining us today, just in case we do get cut on the other end. This is Writer's Quicksand, Analysis Paralysis. And we're going to start with the question of what is analysis paralysis, and the kind of follow-up of how would you differentiate it from writer's block, if you would. And again, we can start with Rosiee.
Oh no. That's such a good question, and it's interesting because I don't know the answer, and I'm here on this panel as an expert, and I got the questions and I was like, oh gee, how are these different? I don't know. I hope people have good answers to this, but I will do my best to kind of give my answer, I guess, where writer's block, I think, is sort of like an umbrella term for being unable to push forward in the work that you're doing. And analysis paralysis to me is a type of writer's block. It's not, it's sort of like underneath the umbrella of writer's block, but it's like not all rectangle, or not all rectangles are squares, but all squares are rectangles, kind of a thing. Analysis paralysis to me is when you are experiencing writer's block due to your own brain getting in the way. It's sort of a version of this thing that we kind of all experience on some level or another during part of our writing process, but your brain is going like maybe too fast for your productivity, and you are thinking too much about the story to be able to actually write it. You might be caught up in a loop of kind of a imposter syndrome, thinking, trying to think your way out of a problem, when what you really need to be doing is writing your way out of a problem. That's sort of how I think of it. I don't know if anyone else has a better answer than me.
I think that was a pretty solid start. Gemma, what else do you have to add?
Yeah, so for me, the way I thought about analysis paralysis was that it's where you've got too much choice. So if writer's block is kind of you can't think of the way forward, your mind goes blank, then analysis paralysis is where you've just got too many options and you don't know which way is the right way. And then I think you can start questioning yourself, and that's where the imposter syndrome that you mentioned, Rosiee, comes in, and you start thinking, oh, am I even good enough as a writer? And you know, it can all spiral and lead to some very negative thoughts. So that was the way I thought about the question. It's almost like overload. You've got too much that you're trying to think of, and you don't know which direction you could take it in. And any of them could be right. Like any of them could be a great story.
I kind of think of analysis paralysis is when you have too much to say, and maybe writer's block is when you don't know when you don't really know where to start. Maybe that would be how I define the difference. I think the end result is the same because you can't really move forward. But if I were gonna differentiate between the two, that's what I would call it. What about you?
I think of analysis paralysis as kind of overthinking things to the point where you can no longer make any action because you're so convinced that the action you make is either going to be the wrong one or that you would have made a better one if you thought about it a little bit more. But as far as writer's block goes, I think anything that keeps you from writing is writer's block. So there's not really that much of a distinction. As you said, you're not getting words down on the paper no matter what you do.
I agree with both Rosiee and Gemma. I think writer's block, again, is an umbrella term that captures a lot of different problems that can befall a writer. And I think it is paralysis analysis is having too many choices and being kind of have these obsessive thoughts about trying to figure out which is the correct one or the right one. Which is the most marketable or which will connect with readers the most, and assuming that one of those choices is going to be the right choice, and you have to figure out which of the choices that is.
And you actually just kind of perfectly teed up the next question that I had, which is, when might a writer in particular struggle with analysis paralysis? Do you think there's a stage of the process, a stage of your writing career, other causes like too many choices due from an impending deadline or lack thereof, or, conflicting information from outside sources? Is there a time that you've experienced it, kind of like notice that pattern, or what are thoughts?
So I think it could happen at any stage in the writing process, at any stage of your career. For me, it happened, I had a really terrible experience writing my second book, which many people do. And it sounds a little weird, but it actually kind of broke my brain and gave me a little bit of trauma. And so when I was trying to write after that for like the last, or the year and a half after I had turned in my second book, every time I would have to make a choice about which direction the plot was going to go while I was writing, I would start to have panic attacks. And I think it was really about kind of like the uncertainty of where my career was going next. It was a lot about having just a terrible experience with writing on deadline for the first time and having to make a lot of decisions really quickly and feeling that extra pressure of having readers' expectations and publishers' expectations. And so I think for me, that's just when it popped up for me. But I think really it could happen at any time for anybody, depending on how your brain chooses to react in that setting.
I know for me, I am an anxious person in general. So when I was first starting out, I was anxious that I didn't know enough. And now that I'm kind of a later career writer, I'm anxious that I'm not doing it as well as I think that I should be doing it. So I think, I always tell my students that comparison is a form of self-harm. So you shouldn't compare yourself to other writers. But what I find myself doing is comparing present Finn with past Finn. So a lot of times I'll go, oh, well, last year I submitted 30 things in January, and this year I've only submitted one thing and it was rejected. And so for me, I think a lot of my paralysis comes from wondering whether I'm going to be able to do it as well as I should, or I want to submit to this contest, but is this story good enough for this contest? And so a lot of times I kind of self-edit myself before I even put myself out there. So that for me is a big thing to overcome, no matter what career stage you're in. What do you think about that, Matthew?
That is, when you said don't compare yourself to past self, I'm like, that is profoundly accurate. I found, because I first came out of newspapers, which is just deadlines, and it's my first editor said done is good. Like, that's it, just done is good. Better would be better, but done is all we really need to get the thing out. And that helped me early on as a novelist, because that kind of got some of that initial fear of like perfectionism out of the way. It's like, done is good. But I was really prolific when I first started out. I think I put out maybe 8 books in 6 years or something like that. But then I ran out of steam, and I continually, even now, like I say, don't like you say, don't compare yourself to your current self to past self, but I still do anyway. Like, oh, I used to be so much more prolific. What happened? And I think sometimes you just, because writers overthink, and if I know most of what we do is like staring at the wall, but that's a really hard job of staring at the wall, and it takes a lot of energy and a lot of effort, and it's okay to admit that sometimes you're just you're overwhelmed, even if it looks like you're doing nothing. You look like you're staring off into space, but you're actually overwhelmed trying to get to that next step in the writing process. So it's okay, and it's okay to change pace or change process, because nobody's perfected it yet, right?
So I find that I get it pretty regularly with most of my books, and it normally occurs around the messy middle point. So for writers, I'm sure you all know, but I'll explain it anyway in case there are any super new writers. So it's a pretty common term for when you get to about the middle of the book and you just start sort of not loving it as much as you did when you were started writing and you had your great idea, because that's like the hard work. And for me, certainly, it's the hard slog to then get through to the end. But I recognize this now. So I've written quite a few books. I think I'm up to 9 or something published. So it's, for me, I now have like a system to go through, which I'm happy to share. So what I do is I get to the point where I feel out of love with it, and where it could go in a number of different directions, and I'm not really sure how best to get there. But what I'll normally have is quite a clear view of a later scene that I'm much more excited about. So that could be like the climax, it could be a big fight, it could be a bit of a romantic scene, but there's something further in the book that I will normally know what's going to happen. So I tend to skip ahead, write that down, kind of get that, and then all of a sudden I know where the characters need to get to and what decisions they might be making to get them there. And then that really helps because you have a direction. So I think part of the problem with analysis paralysis is that you can get it because you're lacking a direction, because it could go anywhere. So that's sort of one of my tips for how to get out of it is give yourself a direction by writing something else. And then you can change it later if it still doesn't work, but it helps me to get the focus back.
I think that's so interesting. I experience analysis paralysis probably like the complete opposite of you, Gemma. I don't usually experience it when I'm actually writing the book. Once I've set pen to paper and I have an outline and I'm good to go, I don't usually experience it. And I am partially a discovery writer, so you would think that I would struggle with that a little bit. But I actually find that I experience the most analysis paralysis at the idea stage. And part of this, I think, has a lot to do with what Lora Beth was talking about with publishing itself, and just like the kind of the weird trauma that you undergo with traditional publishing, at least, and that constant sort of second guessing of, is this idea good? Will my audience like it? Will my publishing house like it? Will they buy it? Will I make money, etc.? And I'm kind of in the same boat as you, where I have experienced a sort of weird sort of publishing trauma of all of those things kind of combining into a short period of time, and experiencing this kind of self-esteem low of, oh my gosh, everything I write is bad, or everything I write will not appeal to the specific gatekeepers who matter for my career. And that's really tricky. And so I have found myself currently actually in an analysis paralysis situation where I cannot seem to move past the stage of generating ideas into picking one and running with it. And it's largely, I think, because of that uncertainty of what will publishing accept from me and what will they be interested in. And on some level, I keep trying to just shut that voice down, because it's feeding on insecurities that are not actually relevant to my next steps. They're relevant in general to like publishing, but they shouldn't actually impact what I do next. I should just pick a story and start writing it, because if I don't pick a story, then I'm not getting any further in my process. But that's where I experience it most commonly, is right at the beginning, before I have really committed to an idea. I have this sort of kind of waffling stage where I sit there and I don't know what to work on next. And that's really difficult for me. Once I'm on deadline, or once someone is expecting the book from me, I have no trouble, and I don't usually experience that sort of thing, but I do get it kind of in that early stage. And I think a big part of that has to do with the fact that I have ADHD and I have a really hard time focusing unless someone else has kind of given me a deadline or given me a purpose that, yes, you have to focus on this. This is due at some point. Otherwise, I just kind of like a jester juggling balls with no sense of coordination.
I do want to kind of piggyback off that. I do think there is a neurodivergent aspect to analysis paralysis. I have ADHD as well, and OCD, and I think both of those kind of feed into that trouble focusing on one thing and choosing that thing that you're going to focus on. So I definitely think there is a component in there that gets especially bad for those of us who have neurodivergent brains.
I
Totally
definitely
agree.
can't argue. And that actually kind of helps lead into our next kind of set of questions, which all of you kind of touched on a little bit. So Gemma kind of brought it up first, but tips for combating analysis paralysis. But I'm curious in terms of tools, whether it's systems you've created for yourselves or actual, like writing tools, in terms of getting, feedback from outside sources. Also, pantsers versus plotters. It always kind of comes down to that, because if you're a discovery writer versus if you're someone who outlines every single stage, I'm sure that can kind of play into it, as well as self-care and what not to do. So any of that, I know I kind of gave a lot of things all at once, but they all kind of tie together. So any of you, if we want to kick things off, curious to hear what you have to say.
I'll start. First of all, because I was in, kind of a funk with my brain, seeing a therapist really helped. And also getting some like coping mechanisms for that, but applying it to writing. So one of the things that we worked in therapy was whenever I would start to have a panic attack while I was writing, I would switch my focus to something that was related to the book, but not writing. And so one thing that I got really into was drawing little character sketches. And I'm not good at drawing. I would basically trace celebrities and then like color it in. But I would, at any time I would start to feel that panic coming on, I would switch over to my little tablet and I would start, sketching the characters. And it was a different type of creativity and a different type of creation that was really low stakes, but it didn't feel like I was giving up on the book, because I was still like in that space where I was thinking about the characters. I was just thinking about like what they look like and what their body language is, and just having this my focus shift to something that was very visual instead of being in my head. And I think like that being in your head is a big part of that paralysis. So I would just switch my focus and I would stay in that little drawing space until I felt myself calm down. And then I would go back and go back to writing. And when I first started doing that, I barely got any writing done, because like I would go back to writing and I would start to get panicky and I would just spend a whole lot of time drawing. But the more time that I worked with it and the more time that I was writing and then nothing bad happened. Like I was writing and I was exploring and it was fun and it felt like a safer place. Then the more I would spend writing. So that really worked for me. But it was a slow process. And I think everybody has to figure out what kinds of tricks work for their brain, and how to kind of ease yourself into this idea that writing is fun. Like we all started writing because it was fun and it was, a joy to create these worlds. And I think especially if you go into especially traditional publishing, but like any kind of publishing or any kind of situation where other people are involved in the work, sometimes we forget that joy. And so I think calming your mind down so that you can get back to that place where you're just excited to create and just you know, any of these possibilities of where to take the plot next are, you know, they're all going to be fun, and just be excited to choose one and see what happens.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal point about how reframing your mindset about what is part of the writing process even, and getting back to that excitement can be huge.
I mean, I think that's all brilliant. I love the idea of kind of creating a space for you to engage with storytelling that isn't as stressful as writing. I'm going to try that. I'm like obsessed with that idea. Like, you said it in my brain, that like screeched to a stop. That was like, oh, that's genius. And so that, I think that's brilliant. I do that a little bit with some things, like I create playlists for the characters and stuff, and that's fun. But I really like this idea of like purposefully doing that. For me, a really, really important tool is having community. I think that having writing friends that I can talk to about my ideas, that I can share with them and say, hey, here's what I'm thinking about. Does this make any sense? Does this sound like a good idea? And having them either tell me yes or no, people that I can really trust, who aren't just going to be yes men all the time. That's been really important for me. My agent obviously is a huge bonus in that camp. But another tool that I have used that I found has been really helpful for the writing process, analysis paralysis, is that I do not try to get too far ahead of myself with everything. I find that if I try to outline everything and like nail everything down from the beginning, I first of all, I'm not a rule follower, so I will just veer off in a direction, and then it's all wasted time and effort. But also, that really rigid sort of structure that I have built for myself is faulty. It doesn't make any sense because I don't know actually what I'm going to be creating until I get there. And so I have stopped asking myself to outline in advance so much, and I focus on like one act at a time. And I like to think of it as like, if you're building a fence, you don't just start laying like the fencing immediately without putting in the posts first. And like, you want to have those basic markers, but you don't have to put it all up at once. You can do it piece by piece, and it will still be a fence in the end. So that's how I've sort of overcome the writing process part of an analysis paralysis, is that I take away some of the choice. I don't have to figure it out just yet. And I can write my way into those choices. I allow myself to be a bit more of a discovery writer, and that's scary, but it has worked really well for me.
I actually have it's a funny story because it's happening to me right now. I am a consummate plotter, and I did a pantsing experiment, and it didn't work. It turned out to I am just a plotter. Like I'm an improvisational plotter. I can change from the plot. I'm not locked in, but I need a plan. And I have been working on a novella series, and I'm like, I'm going to plan it as I go, and I'm going to react to my own story as it happens, instead of having a finite ending in mind. And I have hit analysis paralysis because I broke my cardinal rule of always knowing the ending. So I would say, it's experiment with your style, but if you know something that works, it's okay to kind of fall back on, because if you have a tool that does work, and you find that it doesn't work better without it, it's okay to stick with it. Like if you find something that helps you get to the end, do it. Because I am in all sorts of analysis paralysis because I had changed my format and I changed my writing process, and it was this big experiment. And I'm like, and now I'm stuck because now I'm 3/4 of the way into it. Now I have to finish it. And that's a scary prospect.
I think those are all like really great ideas. And I think I'd say that having someone that you can talk to, whether they're a writer or not a writer. So I use my husband a lot as a sounding board, and he's very creative, but he's not a writer. But he's great for just kind of listening, and then he'll be like, oh, what about this? Or what about that? Or would that character do that? Because I talk to him a lot about my characters. So he does know them sort of almost as well as I do. So I think that's, if you're stuck and need a way out, just saying things out loud can really help. I do think that kind of self-care is super important as well. And one of the things, if I'm really stuck, is I enjoy kind of going out into nature a bit and having a bit of a walk, and it just clears the mind. And I think just the physical act of getting away from the desk or whatever space you use for writing and just getting it completely out of sight is super helpful as well. And you can just let your mind wander a bit, and then like a good idea or a solution, I find, will often come like a couple of days later if I've taken a bit of a break from it. The other point that I wanted to make is that writers often put a lot of pressure on themselves with the first draft for it to be perfect. And I think that can add to a lot of this analysis paralysis, because you want to get it right, you want to be so perfect and please your readers. But actually the purpose of a first draft, and this kind of revolutionized how I saw it, so I'll share it here, and hopefully some of you watching at home will also have this light bulb click moment. But the purpose of a first draft is to be a first draft. It's just there to exist as the first version of your story. And then you can go back and edit and change. And I write cozy witch mysteries, so I can add in all the red herrings that my readers love. And I'm like, oh, how did you think of that? It's like, well, that was actually on the third pass through, and I slotted it in, because you don't have to write linearly. So yeah, I would recommend that people don't put so much pressure on themselves with the first draft. It is entirely fine if it is messy, if you leave yourself bits in square brackets or highlights saying, I need to fix this later. That's all good. Just get it done, get the story there, and then you can take a step back and see what's working.
I want to add I don't know if this is like a kind of a contrast to that, because I think that kind of advice is so helpful for, you know, folks who are in that stuck phase. It's just so hard for so many of us to push past the idea that first draft doesn't have to be perfect, and it doesn't have to be perfect. It's like this incredible revolutionary idea that we all have at some point, this light bulb moment. And I worked with that sort of structure for a long time, and it worked really well for me up to a point. And recently I have found that no longer works for me. And I don't know what it is about my structure or my process that has changed, but I have found that I end up hitting a wall because I am partially a discovery writer. And so if I don't go back and fix plot things or character arc things, I won't be able to move forward because the character's wrong or the plot is wrong. And if I am not up to that place emotionally for the character, like exactly where they need to be in a certain emotional state, I won't be able to write the next scene. So if you're coming up on that sort of blockage where you have made a wrong turn, if you're the kind of writer who can take that and go, okay, well, let's pretend that I made the right turn. This is the event that's going to have happened, and now I'll continue on. That's awesome. But if you're not that kind of person, this is me giving you permission to go back and change it. It's okay to do that too, if you have to. I didn't realize that for years that was an option, and it really changed the way that I draft now, because I think that both have such an important place in the drafting process. And if we focus too hard on one or the other, like trying to get that draft out and done, and it doesn't have to be good at all, versus feeling like we're leaving our characters behind because we're not giving them the character arc or the emotional journey that they need in order to make the decisions that have to lead to the next plot point, that can end up being its own sort of analysis paralysis. So, you know, be aware of what your needs are as a writer, I think is something that I've learned recently, and that every writer is going to be different about that sort of thing. And it's really tough because no one writer's advice is going to exactly match up with your experience. So kind of like figure out where on that spectrum you are and take a little bit of each if you need to.
I wonder if the difference between being a career writer and so my career is teaching, and so I have to sit down every day and grade papers and talk to students, and that's my job. So writing for me, I think, is more intuitive, and I am working on another novel, but it's not every day, and it's not sometimes even every week. I sometimes, you know, stare into the ether for an hour, and then all of a sudden, like 200, today I wrote 200 words on that novel, and I was so happy, but there are 200 really good words. So maybe I've been thinking about them for 3 weeks, but there are 250 really great words. I really 100% agree with that concept of sticking with what works for you. If you're a plotter and that works for you, Absolutely. I'm sort of an in-between. I kind of have an idea of where the story is going, and I do like to focus on beats and where I think each plot point should be. And then I also kind of like to go wild sometimes and just let me see where the story can take me. But then I also see that sometimes you'd have that problem that Matthew pointed out, that if you don't know what the ending is, how do you know where you're going, or how do you know what road you're supposed to be on if you don't yet know what the ending is? So I would definitely agree with that whole idea of working with what works for you. And you had asked a little bit about self-care, and I think self-care is hugely important for writers, for paralysis analysis, or for writer's block. I know for myself, if my mental health is in kind of a dive, there's no words, there will be no words coming out. And the ones that do come out I'm going to think they're awful. So self-care is a really huge part of writing.
That echoing that, I what kind of caved my pace there, where I said I wrote a lot in a very short period of time, and when the pandemic hit, and between the pandemic and some work shifts, like I still had work, but it was different work, and I was relearning new jobs and writing on new topics. I switched from healthcare to cybersecurity is one of the things I write about, and I'm learning all these new things, and I had to remind myself, and if anybody knows me personally, hears this, they'll say, he didn't really take care of himself. He beat himself up for 3 years. And I have to admit that, because I'm very bad at the self-care side of things. Because I was, and still, if I'm being completely honest, beat myself up over not being as prolific as I was. And I have to sit down and think sometimes, like, not just but the entire world was in upheaval for a couple of years. It's okay to not be the same writer you were before. I just miss that guy, because he could sit down for 3 hours a night and finish a 100,000 word novel in 6 months. If he had a deadline, like that guy, I miss him because he was really efficient. And this new guy is a little bit sloppy, So, but yeah, that acknowledging when you just, when you've got nothing in the tank, because as you say, you're not going to be particularly happy with the words. I do think that if you feel like you get nothing into the tank and you can play with words a little bit, you'll actually be shocked even when you're mad at yourself. Like, this is not my best work. And you kind of look back, and I found that, particularly with some of the longer books, if there's a chapter I didn't want to write, like, I just can't get through it. And I just forced myself to power through it. Just write the 3,000 words and get through it. I can't find those now, because between editing and revising, and even just the ebb and flow of a good book, there's going to be really strong chapters and kind of normal ones. I don't know which ones bother me anymore. And there were chapters where I was sitting there for hours, like, people listening instead of viewing can't tell I don't have hair, but I would say I was pulling my hair out, but I can't do that. I powered. I just get, it's okay to be mediocre sometimes. Maybe actually convince yourself it's okay to have a mediocre day, and just get some words down there, because you might not know how good you actually are actually at the end of the day in terms of getting through it.
We're our own worst critics. Like, if you came to me and said you were having trouble writing, I would be so gentle and so kind and work with you as to, well, here's things we can do to help you get. And for myself, I'm not writing, oh, what's wrong with you? So yeah, you're absolutely right to, like, kind of silence that inner critic and just get the words out. Yeah, absolutely.
If a writer came to you and said that they're having a tough time, one of my best motivators, when early on, I don't do it as much as I used to, but I would share the ongoing draft with someone without the request for an edit. It was just, are you enjoying it? Like, I don't change any words, don't tell me anything, like, just are you interested? And having anybody asking me questions about what happened next was a huge motivator. It's like, oh, does that mean this? Or hey, that scene with those two, I hope those two get together. And that was almost like a dopamine hit, I think, like, someone cares. I should keep writing. and it kind of helps you make those next decisions to keep going.
I don't know about y'all, but when I first started writing and I would go to, like, author events, part of the time you would get advice that was like, this is one size fits all, and this is how writing works. And I don't know if you guys ever got the advice of, you have to write every day to be an author. You don't have to write every day to be an author, or you have to do this, this, and this. And then I got into the headset where any kind of advice that I heard, whether they presented it as one size fits all or not, I would internalize as this is what writing is, and this is how it has to be done. And it really is about finding what works for you on the project that you are currently working on, because it will change as both Rosiee and Gemma were talking about. What worked for you last time might not work for you this time. And I think that is also a cause of paralysis analysis, is because you keep trying to do the thing that has worked for you before, or do the thing that has been suggested to you before, and that's not working. And you think that there's something wrong with you and not the process in that moment for that specific project. And so I think a lot of times, when I'm talking to my students, I teach college writing, and so they're writing academic stuff. But one of the things that I always tell them is this is the writing process, and it's going to look different for every single person, and it's going to look different for every single project for every single person. And so allowing yourself to try new things and be okay with things changing. I know Rosiee said that they were now changing to be more of a pantser than a plotter, and I'm reverse. I started out as a pantser, and now I have to plot, and it might change in the future. And just being okay with kind of the fluidity of your journey as a writer, I think is really important to have a healthy relationship with your writing.
How rude, honestly, that like you can't just write a book and then replicate the process the second time and it would be like it work, It's like you have to relearn how to write books with every book you write, because the process is going to be different, not only because the book is different, but because you as a writer have changed and you have learned something from the last book that you wrote. And so you have to like reconfigure your writing process. And it's just, I just think it's rude that we have to do that.
Extremely. Like I did this
every
once.
time.
Like I've broken the seal. I should be good now. But none of this worked last time. And that's where, Rosiee, what you were saying about, your process changes, and you have to, I'm in that stage of I am going to have to internalize giving myself permission to go back and fix things, because I radically changed a key part of the story. And so, that's where it's helpful from both of you, like that whole acknowledgement that you have to adjust, and that what worked before isn't going to work can be a huge cause of analysis paralysis. Do we have any final parting thoughts? Any extra things to add we didn't touch on?
Definitely do. I have a group that I call them my queer leaders, and basically they're my rah-rah crowd. So I figure I have editors, I have beta readers, I have critique groups. I like to have people in my life who are solely there, as Matthew said, to read this and tell me if you're enjoying it. And you have to have those people that get you, that know what your voice is, that are going to read your work without trying to change your voice, and who will support you and encourage you to keep going, even when the writing isn't going as well as you want it to be. So developing kind of a squad, and with social media now, it's so much easier to find a community of writers. I have Twitter and Facebook where I have found writing community. I know other people use other ones. And then I have video writing dates with people where we just get together once a week. We say, this is what we're going to work on. We write for an hour. And then at the end, we talk about what we wrote. And for me, that's a huge motivator, because there's somebody else relying on me to be there and to spend time writing in order to help their writing process. And so if nothing else during that hour that week, I'm getting something out. So I can't encourage enough the use of community to try to bolster yourself to get out of that writing quicksand.
It's amazing how much just knowing someone else cares before the book comes out or before the story is published, like that someone just in their heart actually wants to know what happens next is huge. A mechanical thing that I would recommend that I find really helps me is I call it changing the camera angle. If you're really stuck, I write third person limited. So if I'm like, this is just not working, like, what if it's told from her perspective instead of his? Just this one time, we'll just shift the camera angle. And sometimes it really is like looking at the room from a different side, like, oh, the couch isn't supposed to be over there. And it's the simplest little trick to think of, just see through that person's side of the incident or the moment. And I've powered through many a stuck chapter just by going, oh, this isn't Emily's chapter to talk about. This is Billy's chapter, and suddenly I'm able to get through it to the next one that I wasn't stuck on, and I can move forward. So I highly recommend just a little mechanical trick like that to see if that helps. I'm convinced the brain cells rearrange themselves upstairs, and they're like, aha, no, that was a traffic jam, and we just resolved it. But that's my favorite trick for when I'm super stuck. I'm like, oh, this just isn't that person's moment to be the center of attention. Let me try it from somewhere else.
I would like to suggest getting a hobby that is not related to writing at all. I resist, this is the advice that people give you, and this might be a one size fits all piece of advice, and I resisted for a really long time. And when you don't have anything outside of writing and reading, and everything is bound up into that, when you get that analysis paralysis, it feels like you as a person have stalled. And so I recently started gardening, and it has nothing to do with writing. There are never any flowers or gardens in my books. And it's a space where I can be a separate person and kind of let that go. And it's part of, that self-care. And it, even though it's not related to the writing, it opens up some space in my brain for when I go back into the writing version of me, that has allowed kind of my brain to breathe and have like no pressure and no expectations. Like I get flowers that aren't too hard to grow, and so I just put in a little bit of effort, and then I get all these pretty flowers, and then I feel good about myself, and then I can go back into the writing space and be like, I can make these decisions, and I can keep writing because I grew a rose, and so I can be successful.
How are we the same person? That was the exact same thing that I was going to say when you asked for any closing thoughts. I was like, yes, I do have this one piece of advice. But I really think it's one of the best things I ever did for myself. And specifically, I think this is something that any writers out there who are currently making the jump from writing as a hobby to writing as a career, this is absolutely vital, because when you are a hobbyist writer, writing is something that is, it's a fun thing that you're doing, and it's a place, it's like a hobby that can hold a little bit of your self-worth. I don't know about you, but like when I'm good at something, I will often be like, yes, I do this thing and I'm good at it. And that's how I get some sense of self-worth. When you switch over to writing as a career, suddenly not only is it responsible for your self-worth, but also responsible for your income. And it's represented in numbers. You get that first royalty statement, and suddenly you are getting a number grade on how well your writing did, and specifically how much you as a person with this hobby are worth. And that can be just absolutely devastating, or it can really, really trip you up. And I think having the space to grow some other hobbies is really important. And so I always recommend to pick a hobby that has nothing to do with your writing and cannot be monetized. And so I also picked gardening, but I do vegetable gardening. And I really think that it helps to have something that you do that is just totally unrelated to that you can put a little bit of your self-worth into, that's not going to be represented by a success or failure in terms of numbers, something that's not competitive. I mean, I'm sure there's competitive gardening, but I choose not to believe it is competitive. It's just me competing against the slugs. Okay. That's what we're doing here. But yeah, something like that can be really helpful for the analysis paralysis part of your brain. If you're really getting stuck there, having something else going on in your life that brings you joy can just kind of give you that space to exist outside of that part of your brain.
Oh my goodness, do not get me started on the slugs over here in the UK at the moment. My broccoli plants are not doing well. But that aside, I think my piece of advice would be a bit more introspective. So like, know yourself. And it's fine for that to be a journey and for you to change. But the more you understand what works for you, how you're going to work best, and you can take that into account. So for example, I'm quite an introverted person, so meeting up with friends and family, which I absolutely love, takes a lot of my energy, or traveling to London, which I do for my non-writing job, for example, that takes up a lot of energy, and it's very unrealistic of me to expect to be able to write that same day or even the couple of days after, which at the beginning of my writing journey made me feel quite anxious. I wasn't making progress, and maybe it had happened at a time when I was in the middle of a part of the book that I wanted to do, and I've got pre-order deadlines to meet and things like that. Whereas actually now that I know that about myself, I can factor that in, and it helps because there's less pressure, and then it also helps with kind of any analysis paralysis. So if I know, for example, that I'm going to need to jump around or need a bit more time to go over a draft, I can build that in and give myself the time and space. And you may also have learned from this that I am quite an extreme, like, organized person, and I am a plotter. So that's for anyone who recognizes that in themselves. This is me kind of giving you permission to, if you need to block time just to take out away from writing or to recuperate energy, that is fine. Like, manage your own expectations of yourself, and you do that by learning more about yourself and how and what works best for you.
And I think that's a phenomenal point to end our panel on. Thank you all so much for giving us all of your thoughts and very knowledgeable background experiences. Hopefully for anyone joining us during the conference, this has been helpful for you. I know it's been helpful for me because I'm partway through a book that I just changed every single part of. Again, this has been Writers Quicksand Analysis Paralysis for the 2023 Right Hive Convention. Thank you all for joining.